For centuries, European Jews lived under aggressive systemic restrictions. Governments barred them from owning land, limited where they could live, and even forced them to wear specific markings. And despite the modernization of the 19th century, this prejudice didn't disappear. It evolved into organized, racial, and nationalistic hatred. The breaking point for many arrived in Paris in 1894. This is Alfred Dreyfus. He was a high-ranking, thoroughly assimilated French-Jewish military officer. Despite his status and uniform, he was baselessly convicted of treason, framed entirely by anti-Jewish prejudice. Covering that trial was a Jewish journalist from Austro-Hungary named Theodor Herzl. Watching a decorated officer like Dreyfus be publicly scapegoated shattered a widely held assumption. Herzl realized that no matter how hard Jewish people tried to assimilate, they would never truly be safe as a minority in European nations. In 1897, Herzl convened the First Zionist Congress and pitched a radical alternative. He argued that the Jewish people needed to establish a legally guaranteed, autonomous national home in the land of Israel, a region intrinsically tied to 4,000 years of their history. Zionism was engineered as a literal survival mechanism. It was a calculated plan to escape a perpetual state of geopolitical vulnerability and secure self-determination. Following World War I, the map of the Middle East fractured. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the League of Nations handed administrative control of the region to Britain, creating the Mandate of Palestine. The British explicitly backed the creation of a Jewish national home within that territory. But jump ahead to the 1930s, and the situation in Europe deteriorates rapidly. The Nazi regime takes power in Germany, implementing state-sponsored anti-Semitic policies and aggressively expanding their borders. European Jews desperately seek routes out, but as the threat peaks, British authorities drastically restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine. Attempting to suppress regional friction and appease local Arab populations, Britain issues the White Paper of 1939, effectively cutting off the escape route. Exactly when Herzl's vision of an autonomous safe haven became a matter of absolute life and death, the doors were locked by a foreign empire. The consequence of those locked doors was the Holocaust. The Nazis, alongside their allies and collaborators, systematically murdered 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. By the spring of 1945, the Allied victory revealed a continent in ruins. Hundreds of thousands of traumatized Holocaust survivors found themselves stranded across Allied-occupied Europe in temporary displaced persons, or DP camps. Repatriation was utterly impossible. Their families and communities had been completely destroyed. Those who did try to return to their hometowns often faced intense, violent hostility, most notably in Poland during the 1946 Kielce pogrom, where 42 surviving Jews were murdered. The fate of these stranded survivors rapidly ignited a bitter diplomatic standoff, starting here with U.S. President Harry S. Truman. Truman dispatched an envoy to inspect the DP camps. The resulting report blistered with criticism over the overcrowding and unsanitary conditions. Armed with this assessment, Truman officially demanded that Britain immediately issue 100,000 immigration permits for Jews to enter Palestine. British Prime Minister Clement Attlee flatly refused. He argued the influx would ignite regional instability and warned Truman that pushing the issue would severely strain relations between the United Kingdom and the United States. The survivors were now pawns in a post-war chess match between superpowers. For the Zionist movement, this gridlock proved a bitter reality. Relying on the goodwill and political convenience of other nations was a failed strategy. Frustrated by the bureaucratic dead end, Jewish survivors and underground organizations bypassed the international diplomats and took the initiative. An organized underground network called the Briha, meaning flight in Hebrew, smuggled over 100,000 Jews out of Eastern Europe. They moved them to the coast, launching an armada of unauthorized retrofitted transport ships bound directly for Palestine. Britain responded with heavy military force. The Royal Navy intercepted the transport ships at sea, denying them entry to ports, and forcing over 50,000 Jewish refugees into militarized internment camps on the island of Cyprus. The tipping point arrived with this vessel, the Exodus 1947. The British intercepted the ship and its 4,500 Holocaust survivors. Denying them entry, British forces forcibly deported the passengers all the way back to camps in the British occupation zone of Germany. the international press covered the deportation intensely. Forcing Holocaust survivors back behind barbed wire in Germany triggered a global public relations disaster, proving to the world that Britain's occupation of Palestine was both politically and morally untenable. Unable to contain the escalating crisis and hemorrhaging international support, the British government tapped out. They handed the entire Palestine dilemma over to the newly formed United Nations. This animated map illustrates the United Nations solution. On November 29, 1947, the General Assembly voted to partition the British Mandate into two distinct nations, one Jewish and one Arab. Jewish leaders accepted the UN recommendation. Arab leaders rejected it entirely. Facing an impending conflict, the British military formally began packing up and withdrawing its forces. The geopolitical vacuum was finally filled on May 14, 1948. David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, stood up and officially declared the establishment of the modern state of Israel. In his declaration, Ben-Gurion specifically cited the Holocaust. He explicitly framed the new state as the necessary geopolitical cure to the historical problem of Jewish homelessness, a place that would grant the nation the status of a recognized equal member of the international community. The impact was immediate. President Truman formally recognized the new state of Israel that very same day. All British immigration restrictions evaporated, and Jewish survivors immediately began arriving in their new country. These survivors did not arrive to a quiet peace. They were immediately thrust onto the front lines, fighting and dying in the 1948 to 1949 Arab-Israeli War for independence. But the context of their fight had shifted completely. For the first time, they were operating as a sovereign military force defending their own borders, rather than a persecuted minority begging for protection. The crucible of the 1940s ultimately forced Theodore Herzl's century-old hypothesis into reality. Through sheer geopolitical persistence, European Jews transitioned from dependents of shifting empires into the authors of their own destiny.